The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Marcus Thompson made his way down the weathered wooden planks of Cedar Point Pier. The familiar creak of the boards under his boots brought a small smile to his face. At 32 years old, Marcus carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier, even in his simple fishing clothes. The cool morning breeze carried the salty scent of the ocean, reminding him how different this was from the dry heat of Afghanistan. After 3 tours as an army ranger, these quiet moments at the pier had become his sanctuary. Here, the only explosions were the occasional slap of waves against the pillars, and the only commands came from seagulls squawking overhead. Marcus set down his tackle box, an old metal case that had belonged to his grandfather. The box was scratched and dented, but like its current owner, it had character earned through years of service. Inside were carefully organized lures, some of them vintage pieces passed down through 2 generations of Thompson men. He handled each one with care, especially the lucky copper spoon lure that his grandfather had used to catch his first marlin back in 1962. As he prepared his fishing rod, Marcus's mind wandered to his last video call with his mother. She worried about him being alone so much, but she didn't understand that this solitude was different from isolation. Here, watching the sun paint the sky in streaks of orange and pink, he could finally process everything he'd seen and done during his service. The pier stretched out before him like a runway to peace, its wooden railings weathered by countless storms but still standing strong. Marcus chose his usual spot, about halfway down the pier where the water was deepest. He discovered this sweet spot during his first week back home, and it had yet to disappoint him. Other fishermen knew Marcus by now, the quiet soldier who always arrived at dawn. They respected his space, understanding without being told that he preferred the tranquility of the early morning hours. Sometimes they would exchange nods or brief waves, a silent brotherhood of early risers who found their peace in the rhythm of casting and reeling. Today, the pier was especially quiet. Marcus began his ritual with practiced movements, checking his line for wear, tying on a lure, and testing the drag on his reel. Each action was precise and purposeful, skills learned in the military transferring naturally to this peaceful pursuit. His hands, which had once handled weapons with the same precision, now worked to thread a simple fishing line through the eyes of his rod. The first cast of the day arsed gracefully through the morning air, the lure catching the early sunlight before disappearing beneath the surface with a satisfying plunk. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of moving water wash over him. These were the moments that helped ease the memories of gunfire and explosions that sometimes crept into his dreams. A slight tug on his line brought his attention back to the present. Marcus adjusted his grip, feeling the familiar excitement of a potential catch. This was why he loved fishing, the anticipation, the patience, the reward of persistence. It reminded him of the better parts of his military training, staying focused, reading the situation, and knowing when to act. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the wooden planks beneath his feet. A few early joggers passed behind him on the pier, their footsteps creating a steady rhythm that blended with the natural sounds of the morning. Marcus acknowledged them with a slight nod, but kept his attention on his line, where something promising was starting to show interest in his lure. In these peaceful moments, Marcus felt most like himself. Not Sergeant Thompson, the Army Ranger, not the soldier with 2 purple hearts, but simply Marcus, the boy who learned to fish from his grandfather, who found joy in the simple pleasure of a quiet morning by the water. Little did he know that this tranquil morning was about to change dramatically, but for now, he was content in his solitude, watching his line cut a gentle arc through the calm waters below. The peaceful morning shattered at precisely 8:07 a.m. The first sign was a distant rumble, like approaching thunder on a clear day. Marcus knew that sound well, motorcycles, and not just 1 or 2. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening slightly around his fishing rod as the rumbling grew louder. 5 motorcycles pulled into the pier's parking lot, their engines deliberately revving in a show of noise that sent nearby seagulls scattering into the sky. The bikes were all custom choppers, gleaming with chrome and painted in dark colors with flame designs. Each one bore the distinctive emblem of the Road Devils Motorcycle Club, a grinning devil's head wrapped in chains. Marcus kept his eyes on his fishing line, but his military training had already catalogued every detail. 5 riders, 4 men and 1 woman. The leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, which had earned him the nickname Snake, killed his engine last. The sudden silence felt almost as loud as the bikes had been. Their boots clomped heavily on the wooden planks as they made their way down the pier. They carried fishing gear, but Marcus had been here long enough to know they rarely did much actual fishing. The road devils had claimed this pier as their territory every Saturday morning for the past few months, usually showing up just late enough to disrupt the peaceful morning crowd. Well, looks like we got ourselves some early morning competition. Snake's voice carried across the pier, deliberately loud. He was speaking to his group, but the words were meant for Marcus to hear. The other bikers laughed on cue, the sound as artificial as their tough guy posturing. Marcus continued to focus on his fishing, but his awareness had shifted to high alert. 3 of the bikers set up their gear about 20 feet to his right, while Snake and a heavily muscled man with a thick beard positioned themselves to his left. They were boxing him in, a basic intimidation tactic that Marcus had seen used in markets in Kandahar. The woman, who wore a leather vest with Viper stitched across the back, turned up a portable radio. Hard rock music blasted across the previously tranquil morning, loud enough to spook any fish within casting distance. A few other early morning fishermen further down the pier began packing up their gear, throwing annoyed but helpless looks in the bikers' direction. "Hey, military boy," Snake called out, noticing Marcus's rigid posture and regulation haircut. "This ain't a government facility. We don't follow orders here." More laughter from his crew, who had begun casting their lines with exaggerated movements, deliberately trying to tangle them with Marcus's line. Marcus remained silent, smoothly adjusting his position to avoid the interfering lines. He dealt with far worse provocations in combat situations. These were just bullies looking for a reaction, and he wasn't going to give them one. He reeled in his line slowly, planning to move to another spot. "What's wrong, soldier boy? Don't they teach you how to talk in the army?" The bearded man taunted, exchanging smirks with Snake. They had positioned themselves closer now, close enough that Marcus could smell the lingering scent of cigarettes and leather. The other morning regulars were all gone now, leaving Marcus alone with the road devils. He noticed a few people watching nervously from the beach, one with a phone in hand, probably debating whether to call the police. But the local cops had been hesitant to intervene with the road devils without clear evidence of wrongdoing, and intimidation was hard to prove. Snake moved closer, deliberately bumping Marcus's tackle box with his boot. The old metal case scraped against the wooden planks, the sound setting Marcus's teeth on edge. Inside were his grandfather's irreplaceable vintage lures, carefully preserved through decades of use. The morning sun now felt too bright, too harsh, highlighting every detail of the confrontation that was building. Marcus knew he was at a turning point. Sometimes keeping the peace meant standing your ground. As he finally turned to face Snake, his movement was controlled, deliberate, and spoke of years of combat training. The morning was about to take a very different turn. Marcus stood his ground as Snake circled around him, like a predator sizing up its prey. But Snake had no way of knowing that he wasn't dealing with prey at all. Years of combat training had taught Marcus to read body language, and everything about Snake's movement screamed of false confidence, the kind that crumbled when truly tested. "You government types think you own everything, don't you?" Snake spat the words out, his neck tattoo seeming to writhe with each movement of his jaw. "Coming here with your fancy fishing gear, acting all superior." He gestured to Marcus's worn tackle box, which had seen better days but was clearly well maintained. The other road devils had formed a loose circle now. Viper had turned down the radio slightly, not out of courtesy, but to better hear any confrontation that might unfold. The bearded man, who the others called Beast, cracked his knuckles with deliberate slowness. "I'm just here to fish," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady and controlled. He began to reel in his line, his movements unhurried despite the tension in the air. His training had taught him that showing fear or anger would only escalate the situation. Snake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Just here to fish," he says. He turned to his gang, spreading his arms wide. "Well, boys and girls, maybe we should show the soldier boy how we fish around here." He reached for Marcus's fishing rod, but his hand stopped mid-air when he met Marcus's gaze. For just a moment, Snake saw something in those eyes, something that spoke of battles fought and won, of life-and-death situations that made this peer confrontation seem like child's play. But pride and an audience made Snake push forward anyway. "You know what I heard about soldiers?" One of the other bikers called out, a thin man with a patchy beard who went by Razor. Heard they're all brainwashed. Can't think for themselves without someone giving them orders. Marcus continued his methodical preparation to move spots, checking his line for tangles. Each movement was precise, purposeful, and controlled. He'd learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the best defense was to appear completely unaffected by attempts at provocation. Maybe he needs orders, Snake sneered, stepping closer. Attention, soldier. He barked the words in a mocking military tone. I order you to get your government-loving ass off our pier. The other road devils laughed on cue, but Marcus noticed how their laughter seemed forced, uncertain. His calm demeanor was clearly unsettling them. They were used to people either fighting back immediately or running away in fear. His controlled response didn't fit either category. As Marcus finally turned to move to another spot, Snake deliberately stuck out his boot, tangling it in Marcus's fishing line. The line pulled tight, threatening to snap. Inside, Marcus felt a flash of anger, not at the childish provocation, but at the disrespect being shown to his grandfather's old fishing gear. Oops, Snake said with fake innocence. Guess I'm just clumsy. He twisted his foot, putting more strain on the line. Marcus took a slow, deep breath. He'd learned this technique during his first tour, a way to stay focused when every instinct screamed for action. The morning sun was higher now, casting stark shadows across the wooden planks of the pier. A few early beach visitors had stopped to watch the scene unfold, keeping their distance but unable to look away. You got two choices, Marcus said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made even Snake pause. You can untangle your foot from my line, and we can all enjoy our morning fishing, or you can make a decision you'll regret. The words hung in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm. Snake's face reddened, his fake smile turning into something uglier. He hadn't expected this kind of quiet confidence, and it was clearly getting under his skin. The next few moments would determine whether this situation would end peacefully or escalate into something more serious. Snake's response to Marcus's warning came in the form of a deliberate kick to the tackle box. The old metal case skittered across the wooden planks of the pier, its rusty hinges groaning in protest. The sound hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because of the disrespect to his property, but because of what he knew was inside. The box flew open as it hit the pier's railing, and time seemed to slow down for Marcus. He watched as his grandfather's vintage lures, each one carrying decades of memories and irreplaceable value, spilled out. Some caught on the wooden planks, but others, including the lucky copper spoon lure from 1962, tumbled through the gap in the railing and disappeared into the water below. A soft plunk marked each lure's entry into the ocean, the sound mixing with the satisfied chuckles of the road devils. Marcus stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the ripples where his family's heritage had vanished beneath the waves. The morning sun caught the last few rings spreading across the water's surface, like time itself marking the moment everything changed. Oops, Snake said, drawing out the word with exaggerated innocence. Guess you'll need to go shopping for some new toys, soldier boy. He high-fived Beast, who let out a rumbling laugh that didn't quite mask his nervousness. Even the tough biker had sensed something shift in the air. Marcus's reaction wasn't what any of them expected. There was no explosion of anger, no cursing, no wild swing of fists. Instead, he turned to face them with the kind of calm that comes from years of operating in life-or-death situations. His movements were smooth and deliberate as he set his fishing rod carefully against the railing. Those lures, Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the pier, belonged to my grandfather. He used them to teach my father to fish, and my father used them to teach me before he died in Desert Storm. Snake opened his mouth for another taunt, but something in Marcus's eyes made the words die in his throat. The soldier's stance had shifted subtly, nothing dramatic, just a slight adjustment in the way he carried his weight. But to anyone trained in combat, the change would have been as clear as a drawn weapon. I've spent the last 3 years teaching young soldiers how to stay alive in combat, Marcus continued, his hands relaxed at his sides. The first lesson is always about choice. Every conflict is a choice, and right now, you have one last chance to make the right one. Viper, who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward. Snake, she said, a note of warning in her voice. Maybe we should. But Snake was too far committed to his role as the tough guy leader. His pride wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of his crew. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Marcus until they were almost nose to nose. Or what? Snake snarled, his breath hot with the smell of stale cigarettes. You gonna show us some fancy military moves? There's 5 of us and 1 of you, tough guy. A small crowd had gathered at the pier's entrance now, drawn by the confrontation. Someone was filming with their phone, but neither Marcus nor the bikers paid them any attention. The morning had grown still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Marcus looked at each of the road devils in turn, his gaze steady and evaluating. His mind automatically catalogued their positions, their stances, their likely reaction times, all the tactical details that had kept him alive in combat zones. But this wasn't Afghanistan, and these weren't enemy combatants. They were bullies who had made a series of poor choices, and they were about to make one more. Last chance, Marcus said softly, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Walk away. Snake's response was to shove Marcus hard in the chest, expecting the soldier to stumble backward or fall. Instead, Marcus moved like water, his body absorbing and redirecting the force of the push. And in that moment, as Snake's eyes widened in surprise, the real confrontation began. Snake's shove had failed to move Marcus, and that simple fact changed the atmosphere on the pier entirely. The morning sun caught the beads of sweat now forming on Snake's forehead, his confident smirk faltering for the first time. Marcus stood exactly where he had been, as immovable as the pier's concrete pillars beneath them. In the Rangers, Marcus spoke quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from real experience rather than attempted intimidation. We learned that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation is right before it begins. That's when you have the last chance to avoid it. Beast shifted his weight uneasily, his earlier bravado diminishing as he recognized something in Marcus's stance, the way he had positioned himself, the perfect balance that spoke of years of hand-to-hand combat training. Even Viper had backed up a step, her hand unconsciously reaching for Razor's arm. You see, Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving Snake's face, I spent time teaching soldiers how to handle situations exactly like this one. The first thing we teach them is to look for signs of real threat versus simple intimidation. He gestured slightly to Snake's aggressive posture. Right now, you're displaying 17 different signs of someone who's used to people backing down before things get physical. Snake's face reddened, but uncertainty had crept into his eyes. The morning breeze carried the salt air around them, mixing with the tension that hung heavy over the pier. The growing crowd at the pier's entrance remained silent, sensing they were witnessing something more significant than a simple confrontation. The second thing we teach, Marcus went on, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made even the most hardened of the road devils listen, is how to end a fight before it begins. Right now, I can see 4 ways this ends. 3 of them involve you and your friends learning some very painful lessons about combat training. He paused, letting his words sink in. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the pier's supports and the distant cry of seagulls. Snake's gang members exchanged nervous glances, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist under the sun. But there's one way, Marcus said, where everybody walks away with their dignity intact. Where you and your friends get back on your bikes, find another pier, and remember that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose not to fight. Snake's jaw clenched and unclenched, his pride warring with his growing realization that he might have picked the wrong target. His snake tattoo seemed to writhe with tension as he struggled with the decision facing him. You threatening us? Snake managed to growl, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, I'm giving you information to make a better choice. In combat, we call it intelligence briefing. Right now, I'm telling you that I've spent 3 tours dealing with actual threats. People who wanted to kill me and my team. He gestured at the situation around them. This is just you having a bad morning and making worse decisions. The other road devils had unconsciously backed away, forming a wider circle. Even they could sense the difference between their practiced intimidation and the quiet confidence of someone who had faced real danger. Last warning, Marcus said, his voice dropping even lower. Walk away, go find another place to fish, because if you choose to escalate this situation, I promise you'll regret it. Not because I want to hurt you, but because I've been trained to end threats efficiently and decisively. The moment stretched out, taut as a fishing line about to snap. Snake's next move would determine whether this situation ended in peaceful resolution or painful education. His hand had curled into a fist, but uncertainty showed in every line of his body. The choice was his, but Marcus had already shifted his weight slightly, ready for whatever decision Snake made. Snake made his choice in a burst of frustrated rage, swinging a heavy right hook aimed at Marcus's jaw. The punch carried all of Snake's anger and pride behind it, and hit nothing but air. Marcus had shifted exactly 3 inches to the left, letting the punch slide past his ear with millimeters to spare. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the watching crowd. Before Snake could recover his balance, Marcus stepped inside his guard, using Snake's own momentum to guide him forward. In one fluid motion, he locked Snake's extended arm and used a simple wrist control technique that every Army Ranger learned in their first week of hand-to-hand combat training. Snake found himself facing the pier's wooden planks, his arm locked behind him in a hold that sent sharp warnings of pain through his shoulder. He wasn't injured. Marcus had applied just enough pressure to control, not damage, but he was completely helpless. Now, Snake shouted to his gang, his voice strained from his awkward position. Beast charged forward first, his massive frame moving with surprising speed. Marcus pivoted, still maintaining control of Snake, and used his trapped opponent as a barrier. Beast had to check his charge to avoid crashing into his own leader. In that moment of hesitation, Marcus swept Snake's legs out from under him, guiding him to the pier's deck with controlled force. Razor and another biker Marcus hadn't heard named rushed in from opposite sides, thinking they had him flanked. But Marcus moved like water between them, his footwork precise and economical. He caught Razor's wild punch and redirected it into the other biker's charge, sending them stumbling into each other. Viper, showing more tactical awareness than her companions, had circled behind Marcus. She launched a kick aimed at the back of his knee, a move that would have worked on an untrained opponent. But Marcus had spent years training with Israeli Defense Forces specialists who had taught him to feel attacks coming from any direction. He shifted his weight slightly, letting Viper's kick slide off his leg while simultaneously catching her ankle. With gentle but firm pressure, he guided her momentum downward, leaving her sitting on the pier's deck, looking surprised but unhurt. Beast, having recovered his balance, threw a massive haymaker that could have ended the fight if it had connected. Instead, Marcus slipped under the punch and used Beast's forward momentum to introduce him to one of the pier's wooden posts. Beast wrapped his arms around the post to avoid falling, effectively taking himself out of the fight. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 20 seconds. Not a single punch had been thrown by Marcus. He had simply used his attacker's own energy and momentum against them, following the fundamental principles of his military combat training: minimize damage, neutralize threats, and maintain control of the situation. Snake was still on the ground, now rolling over and looking up with a mixture of pain, confusion, and dawning respect. Razor and his friend were untangling themselves from each other, while Viper remained seated on the deck, making no move to continue the fight. Beast was still hugging the post, looking like he wasn't entirely sure what had just happened. The watching crowd had grown larger, and several phones were recording the scene. The morning sun highlighted the aftermath of the brief confrontation. 5 road devils in various states of disarray, and one soldier standing calmly in their midst, barely looking winded. The thing about combat training, Marcus said quietly, addressing all of them, is that it teaches you to end fights, not start them. Everyone okay? His tone was professional, almost gentle, the voice of someone checking on people under his care rather than enemies he had just defeated. A collective groan was his answer. None of the bikers were seriously hurt. Their pride had suffered more damage than their bodies. Marcus had demonstrated a level of skill and control that turned their attempted intimidation into an impromptu lesson in humility. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the morning air. Someone in the crowd had called the police, though the situation was already well under control. Marcus remained standing exactly where he was, his posture relaxed but ready, knowing the next few minutes would require a different kind of careful navigation. The police cruisers pulled into the pier's parking lot with their lights flashing but sirens now silent. The morning sun glinted off their windshields as 2 officers stepped out, hands resting cautiously on their belts as they assessed the scene before them. What they found wasn't the chaotic brawl they'd expected, but rather an unusually orderly aftermath. Marcus stood calmly in the center of the pier, his posture relaxed but alert. Around him, the road devils were in various states of recovery, none seriously injured, but all clearly subdued. The gathering crowd had their phones out, many still recording, creating an unusually well-documented incident. Officer Sarah Chen, a veteran of the local police force, approached first. She dealt with the road devils before, but usually arrived too late to catch them in any actionable offense. This time was different. She could see Snake sitting on a bench, rubbing his shoulder with a chastened expression that she'd never thought she'd witness on the usually arrogant biker's face. "I'm Marcus Thompson, former Army Ranger." Marcus introduced himself before she could ask, his voice steady and professional. "I've got my military ID if you need it." He kept his hands visible and movements slow, habits ingrained from his service years. Officer Chen noticed something else unusual. The road devils weren't protesting or trying to spin the situation in their favor. Instead, they seemed almost thoughtful. Beast, the largest of the group, was actually looking at Marcus with what appeared to be respect. Several witnesses called in, Officer Chen said, gesturing to the crowd. They reported a confrontation, but also mentioned that you showed considerable restraint. Would you like to tell me what happened? As Marcus began explaining the sequence of events, starting with his peaceful morning fishing and ending with the brief confrontation, multiple witnesses stepped forward. An elderly man who introduced himself as Richard Martinez, a regular morning fisherman, had captured nearly the entire incident on his phone. "Been fishing here 30 years, Mr. Martinez said, showing the officers his video. "These road devils have been causing trouble for months, but this young man, he handled it better than anyone I've ever seen. Gave them every chance to walk away, he did." The video footage was remarkably clear, showing not only the confrontation, but also the preceding events, including Snake deliberately kicking over Marcus's tackle box and the loss of the vintage lures. Officer Chen's partner, Officer Mike Sullivan, watched the footage with particular interest. "Those lures that went into the water," Officer Sullivan said, looking at Marcus. "Family heirlooms, weren't they?" Marcus nodded, a flash of genuine loss crossing his face. "My grandfather's collection. Some of them dated back to the 1960s. He taught my father to fish with them, and my father taught me before he was killed in Desert Storm." This detail seemed to stir something in Snake, who had been quietly listening. He stood up, wincing slightly from his shoulder, and approached the officers. "Look," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of humility, "we were the ones who started this. Thompson here," he tried to avoid the fight, "gave us multiple chances to walk away." Viper joined in, her tough exterior somewhat softened. "He could have really hurt us if he wanted to, but he didn't. Just stopped us from hurting him or anyone else." She glanced at Marcus with newfound respect. "Never met anyone who could fight like that and choose not to." Officer Chen took statements from everyone involved, including several witnesses from the crowd. The story that emerged was consistent. A trained veteran had shown exceptional restraint in the face of deliberate provocation, using minimal force to defend himself while protecting others from harm. "Mr. Thompson," Officer Chen said finally, "would you like to press charges?" Marcus looked at the road devils, considering. Snake met his gaze, and for the first time that morning, there was no challenge in his eyes, only understanding. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows on the pier's weathered boards, as if highlighting the opportunity for a fresh start. "No," Marcus said finally. "I don't think that's necessary. Sometimes the best lessons come without criminal records attached." He turned to Snake and his group. "But I would like my grandfather's fishing spot back. There are plenty of other piers along the coast." Snake nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "I run a diving service," he said, surprising everyone. "Not just a biker. If you want, maybe we could try to recover some of those lures. Water's not too deep here, and with good visibility." The offer hung in the air for a moment, unexpected but sincere. Officer Chen watched the exchange with interest, sensing a shift in the dynamics she'd grown used to dealing with. That would mean a lot," Marcus replied, genuine appreciation in his voice. The crowd began to disperse as the officers completed their reports. The road devils gathered their gear, but before leaving, Snake approached Marcus one last time. "You know," he said, awkwardly extending his hand, "not many people earn our respect." But you did it by choosing not to hurt us when you could have. That's something we need to think about. Marcus shook his hand, his grip firm but friendly. Combat teaches you that the toughest person isn't the one who can hurt others, he said. It's the one who knows how to avoid it when possible. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles and rode away, notably quieter than when they'd arrived, several of the regular fishermen returned to the pier. They gathered around Marcus, sharing their own stories of military service or family members who'd served. The morning's confrontation had transformed into something unexpected, a moment of community building. A week later, Marcus stood at his usual spot on the pier, the rising sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. His grandfather's tackle box sat beside him, and inside it lay 3 recovered vintage lures, including the lucky copper spoon from 1962. Snake and his diving team had spent 2 full mornings searching the waters beneath the pier, refusing any payment beyond the chance to learn proper fishing techniques from Marcus. The road devils never returned to that pier, but occasionally Marcus would see them in other locations along the coast. They'd exchange nods of recognition, and sometimes Snake would stop to chat about diving conditions or fish movements. The confrontation that could have ended in violence had instead led to an unexpected form of respect and understanding. Local fishermen now referred to that morning as the lesson, not because of the combat skills displayed, but because of the more important principles demonstrated: restraint, discipline, and the power of choosing peace when possible. For Marcus, it had reinforced what he'd learned in the Rangers, that true strength often shows itself most clearly in the fights you choose not to fight. The pier remained his morning sanctuary, but now it held new memories alongside the old ones. As he cast his line into the gentle waves, using his grandfather's recovered lucky lure, Marcus reflected that sometimes the deepest wounds can heal in unexpected ways, and the best victories are the ones where everyone walks away having learned something valuable. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, another day beginning on the pier. The familiar creaking of the wooden boards, the cry of seagulls, and the rhythmic sound of waves created the peaceful symphony that had drawn him here in the first place. But now, these sounds carried an additional note of harmony, a reminder that even in moments of conflict, there's always a path to understanding, if we're brave enough to choose it.